Well, now what we've got here is the Mark I tank. It's actually the very first tank ever built in 1916, and they were used for the first time in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the Somme on the 15th of September 1916. So it really is the oldest tank of all, if you like, the first tank that ever was. You'll notice the basic rhomboid shape. That's typical of all the British tanks of the First World War. The fact that the tracks go all the way around the hull and they have no suspension at all. You've got rollers in the side of the tracks which run straight on the tracks themselves, and they're clattering across country. This is a male tank, and 75 of these were built. The other 75 were all females. Instead, they had sponsons on the side with machine guns in, rather than those cannon that you can see in this one. While we're here, it may be also just having a quick look at the roof. It's a framework of timber and chicken wire or barbed wire netting stretched over the top of the tank, and it's designed to prevent grenades from lodging on top of the tank. They thought the Germans, being an unkind lot, would rush up and throw grenades on top of the tank. Talking of colour, the actual rather gaudy colour scheme on the side of this tank, which was painted on when they were in England, got so plastered with mud after the tanks had been running a short while, it became absolutely useless. And from, say, December 1916, they painted all the tanks in overall brown colour because there wasn't any point in painting fancy artwork on the sides of them. Now, this is the Mark V tank of 1918, and although it looks very similar to the earlier ones, to the Mark IV for instance, inside it's totally different. It's got a new engine which was designed by Harry Ricardo, who was a young engineer in those days. It's a 6-cylinder petrol engine, but it's actually designed to deliver 150 horsepower, so it's a good deal more powerful. But it drives into an epicyclic steering system invented by Walter Wilson. It means that the driver, sitting up here, can drive the tank without the need of the 3 other people you had in the earlier tanks. It made it a lot easier to drive. It meant that the tank across country could wiggle about quite easily, and that had a detrimental effect on Germans who were trying to wriggle out of its way. But otherwise, it's very much the same. This particular tank was in action. We know it was in action. We've seen the report. And it's got the unditching beam rails, you can see them up here, and it's got the unditching beam on top. And the idea of the beam was that if the tank got bogged down in the mud, as it often did, you chained the beam to the tracks, it was dragged around the front here, and gave the tank something to bite on so that it could climb out of a muddy hole. It seemed to work, but I don't think it did the tank a lot of good, sort of swinging off the tracks.
The Mark IV is the tank Britain makes the most of in World War I. Over 1,000 of these are made. It follows on that classic rhomboid shape that you see with the Mark I tank. The rhomboid shape, it's there so it can crush the wire down underneath as it goes forward, and hopefully as well, in the early models, this would allow you to actually cross the width of a German trench. Now here is a differential. I'm actually sitting on the starting handle. 4 of the soldiers are needed just to turn that to get this engine going. and there is no suspension at all. So when we maneuver along, everything we're going to feel, we're going to be rocking all over the place. And as you can see, this is very much pre-health and safety. Just here, this is where we'd have two gunners on either side. You've got a loader. They'd be picking up the 6-pounder rounds, just about this size. 6-pounder, the weight a shot of the projectile. Nowadays, we judge the gun on the size of the hole on the barrel. About a 57mm is a 6-pounder gun. And you can see all around the vehicle, there's stowage points for the 6-pounder ammunition. Now, if you're on a female tank, you would have Lewis guns or Hotchkiss guns here on the sponsons. And again, there's spaces all around for boxes of ammunition to supply those weapons. The 6-pounder here, loader and gunner. The gunner is looking through this sight. It's a 2-time sight, and he'd be using this piece here to push and elevate or depress the gun. And from side to side, he leans his body weight on it to get traverse. Now, the truth is, one of these guns here, the gunner is going to find it very, very hard to find a target to actually fire at. He uses this little pistol grip here to actually fire when he's seen something. And the problem there, of course, is on those First World War battlefields, not only is it hard to actually see anything in the front line to fire at, you're actually going from a very, very unbalanced position. You're going to be feeling everything as you go over. So the only chance this gunner's really got of hitting something accurately is if he gets the commander's attention, stops the tank, or sometimes it was the other way round. The commander would stop the vehicle, indicate to the gunner where he can fire his 6-pounder rounds. Now, we've actually got a seat up here at the front. Our visibility through this aperture, which would be closed when we were going into action, would be very minimal, because we end up then looking through a tiny periscope going forward. The front here, we get a bit of fresh air coming through from the front. The rest of the crew are slowly going to be poisoned by carbon monoxide.
The A7V is probably the most unusual tank you'll see. And this isn't the real thing, this is a replica. There's only one real one left, and that's in Australia. It's a bit of a long way to go just to see a tank. But it's an interesting tank all the same. Although the Germans only built 20 of them, it was built as a lesson, really, in tank construction, following our early attempts to show them a tank in the 15th of September 1916. They thought they could do better, and in some respects they did. But being perhaps German, they wanted a thing that was far more practical, a sprung vehicle that was far more practical on the battlefront than ours. The trouble was, what they forgot about was the fact that you need all-round tracks like the British tanks had to get over the rougher ground. And failing that, they really built a tank that was disastrous. If it hit anything like uneven ground, it had a nasty habit of falling over. And you spent a lot of time looking at the underside of it for that reason. The actual tank is built like a box, and it's built on tracks which are in fact the Holt Caterpillar tracks. They lengthened them by about 3 units because they wanted a sprung track, and the 3 units are articulated, so it would go over rough ground, but because the front and the back overhung the tracks, it tended to bury its nose in if it got anywhere else. Now, they had, the armour was also better than on a British tank. They had 30mm thick armour at the front and 15 or 20mm at the side. So they were pretty well bulletproof, but still it was a waste of time with the tank so heavy and liable to fall over at a moment's notice. They were armed with a 6-pounder gun. It's the Belgian version of the British 6-pounder. And in fact, it's so similar that apart from the fact that it had a slower rate of fire than the British gun, it was as effective, and it had the advantage that the gun was pointing in the direction the tank was moving, which is a good thing in a way. Now, the crew of one of these things was staggering. In a British tank, you had a crew of 8, if you include the officer who was commanding the tank. The Germans had a crew of 18. There was a cannoneer and a loader for the main gun at the front. There were 2, a loader and a machine gunner for 6 machine guns, 2 at each side and 2 more sticking out the back. And 2 more men sitting up the top there in that cab, and they're the driver and the officer in charge, and a couple of mechanics who were supposed to keep the engines running. Where they went at the rest of the time, I don't know. But that's 18 men. Now, they say that the Germans sometimes put 22 people in here. Whether they were all members of the crew or had a duty, or whether they were just passengers in there to learn the secrets of tank operating, I don't know. But they reckon that if you knock one of these things out, and if the crew got out alive, which they invariably did, you had all them to reckon with before you'd subdued the tank properly, and that was quite difficult. But it's quite an effective vehicle in that respect, apart from this unfortunate habit of falling over. Now, if you can see down this side, there are 2 machine gun positions, one here and one further back, and they would be the same on the other side, and there'd be 2 more sticking out the back of the tank. So it had 6 machine guns altogether. They were the 08 pattern Maxim, which is the big water-cooled Maxim, and they each had 2 men, a gunner and a chap to feed in the bullets. But it makes quite an interesting vehicle. It's probably one of the most amazing tanks you'll ever see. That's it, the A7V. This is the little Renault, the FT17. I say little, it's considered a light tank in its day. It weighed about 7 tons, so it's not all that light, but still. It is in many respects the forerunner of the modern tank. It has far more of the modern tank in it than any British equivalent at the time. The first thing is, of course, the rotating turret with a full 360-degree rotation. And secondly, the engine, which is a 4-cylinder Renault engine, is at the back in a separate compartment. So you've got the crew at the front the engine at the back. It's much more, in that sense, like a modern tank. It's also got a sprung suspension, which the British tanks didn't have. The only difference was that it's only a two-man tank. You've got a driver sitting down the front here and a gunner come tank commander sitting in the turret. The French conceived this as what they called a mosquito tank, the idea being to have them swarm on the battlefield, and there were always too many for the enemy to shoot at. So in theory, at least you won that way. They had 22mm of frontal armour, which was quite good for its day, but it still meant they were vulnerable to field guns and that kind of thing. Now, the sprung suspension's very clever. Works, firstly, you've got a large spring here, which really is actually a track tensioner holding up this bar here, but also there are springs inside the main suspension unit here. The tops of the springs are there, you can see them, and just about, but it means that the tank is actually sprung when it's going across country. So to see one of these going, which I have done in France, it's quite an experience. They're quite a sight. I mean, they rattle along very, very well. And they had quite a reasonable cross-country performance, all things considered, but they had a little tail at the back to help them over trenches and that sort of thing. The turret in this case mounts a heavy machine gun, a Hotchkiss 14mm machine gun. You can also get versions of this turret with angle plates rather than cast, with a 37mm gun in them.
With a machine gun, as a female version or a male version with a Putto cannon, 37mm cannon, these vehicles can help the infantry advance, take a position, and therefore hopefully do go for what they tend to call the break-in stage. The tanks help. Then the breakout stage is when the traditional arm of exploitation, the cavalry, can go through the gap and continue, as well as infantry and then horse-drawn artillery advancing. So Renault looks at this, it starts going into service in 1917, orders are put in for thousands to be made. They are confident this is going to be a successful design, and when you look at it, it's got a lot of features that, again, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and say it's very modern looking, because it's got the first in-service turreted tank. We've already mentioned little Willey was going to have a turret. The idea of carrying weapon systems in a turret is not a new idea, but actually the first British tanks end up carrying the weapon systems on the sides in what they call sponsons. Again, ideas taken from the Navy. Here, on this version, we've got a cast turret carrying a machine gun. Engine in the back, a two-man crew, and this vehicle for the crew inside. The luxury of this vehicle over some of the other ones is it's got suspension. There are actually springs on this suspension. The British early vehicles do not have any form of suspension at all. It's just on rollers as they're going forward, so everyone's going to feel everything inside that vehicle. Now, the Renault tank is a success. It is much more mobile, it's much more effective on the battlefield than those earlier French tanks, but again, it's another one of the vehicles that is coming into service later in the campaign. And what we'll also look at when we look at our First World War is a lot of the design work and some of the developments in the tank don't actually get to see action in scale because the war ends in November of 1918. Most of us in the Western Allies at the time are thinking that war is going to continue well into 1919 before there's some form of conclusion to it or victory for the Western Allies. The November 1918 end of that war is actually something that is a bit of a surprise. 100 years ago, near the village of Villers-Bretonneux, tanks met tanks on the battlefield for the very first time. This is what happened. The Allies knew the Germans were building tanks, and in the winter of 1917-18, the British High Command went to the Tank Corps and said, could they come up with ideas for defeating German tank attacks that they knew would come sometime in 1918. The German A7V tank had been introduced about a month before. It weighed 32 tons, it had a crew of 18 men, and it could travel at about 5 miles an hour. The problem with the A7V is it's fine on flat ground, but on the rougher ground of the Western Front, it could easily topple over or get stuck. But the ground around Villers-Bretonneux was relatively unscathed. So when the German attack came, they could use the A7V tanks to good effect. The German attack began at 4:45 a.m. on April the 24th. High explosive shells and mustard gas combined with the smoke and the fog to sow confusion in the British ranks. And that situation got worse when the German A7V tanks appeared.
Suddenly, at about 7 a.m, looming large and terrible out of the climbing wall of fog, enemy tanks close up. They kept on their way unchecked until they gained a position beside our trenches, which they proceeded to rake with machine gun fire, so covering the assault of the German infantry. The forward companies were, in this way, overwhelmed.
The Germans and their A7V tanks had broken through the British defences, opening up a 3-mile gap in the Allied lines and threatening Amiens. With a dire situation emerging, No. 1 Section, A Company, 1st Tank Battalion, were ordered to the village of Cachy to help hold the line. Lieutenant Frank Mitchell and the crew of his Mark IV suffered from that gas attack. They were ordered into action with the other 2 Mark IV female tanks. Infantry approached Mitchell's tank to tell him German tanks were in the area, and soon Mitchell was to see them for himself. On the approach to Cachy, 3 German A7V tanks appeared over a ridge. 2 of them appeared to hold back, but one of them, called Nixie, commanded by Lieutenant Wilhelm Biltz, continued to advance. Mitchell was the first to see them.
I informed the crew, and a great thrill ran through us all. There, 300 yards away, a round squat-looking monster was advancing, and further to the left and right crawled 2 more of these armed tortoises. So we had met our rivals at last. For the first time in history, tank was encountering tank.
Mitchell fired from the Mark IV tank, but from a rolling, pitching vehicle. Accurate aim by the gunner was almost impossible. So after 25 rounds were fired, Mitchell stopped his tank dead. Despite the risk of being a sitting target himself, he allowed his gunner the chance of accurate fire on the German tanks. Meanwhile, the A7Vs, who had been firing on British trenches, had seen Mitchell's tank and fired at it. Seeing it stop, they assumed a hit and began concentrating their fire on the 2 remaining British female tanks. The machine gun fire of the female tanks had little effect on the armour of the A7V. So they turned west to escape, leaving Mitchell and his crew to face the enemy alone. Now stationary, Mitchell's gunner, Sergeant John Mackenzie, could aim the gun much more accurately. The first round he fired, though, went beyond the A7V. Then Nixer was hit on the right-hand side of the gun. 1 gunner was killed outright, 2 crew members wounded fatally. The rest of the crew abandoned the tank, thinking any moment it might go up in flames.
A door opened, and out ran the crew. We'd knocked the monster out.
Mitchell's crew then turned their attention to the remaining 2 A7Vs, but instead of pushing their numerical superiority, when fired upon, the German tanks backed away in retreat. The first tank versus tank engagement in history was over. But the battle was not. Mitchell continued patrolling in his tank, but he could see the German infantry forming up again, ready for another attack. Mitchell looked out of his tank to the right and he saw a sight that he later described as bringing joy to his heart. 7 Whippet tanks were speeding across the battlefield to attack the forming up Germans. The Whippet was relatively new on the Western Front. It could go at 8 miles an hour, that was speedy for a First World War tank, and it was armed with 3 machine guns. Later in the year, the British at the Battle of Amiens were to use the Whippet to great effect. Mitchell continued his patrolling, but later in the afternoon, his tank was hit by shell fire, broke a track, and that was the end of the battle for Mitchell and his crewmen. The ground lost on the morning of the 24th of April to the German attack was rapidly captured back in a stunningly successful night attack by the Australian 5th Division, supported by British troops. Tanks had saved a very dicey situation in front of Amiens on the morning of the 24th. And afterwards, Frank Mitchell also made mention of the importance of those Whippet tanks.
They gave a striking demonstration of the superiority of speed plus armour plate against unprotected masses of slow-moving infantry.
That battle foreshadowed so many other battles where men in tanks fought other men in tanks. Stories that we tell here at the Tank Museum.